Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and thanks for joining me today for this discussion on the limbic system of the brain. That's right, the limbic system has everything to do with emotion. It's the emotional area of the brain. Now, needless to say, that's pretty crucial because our brain, although we like to think of our brain as a thoughtful, contemplative, decision making, sort of cerebral cortex kind of logical contemplation, a lot of what we need to do is react in the moment, and emotion is part of that. In other words, if we're in a fearful situation, we need to get out of it. And so I want to point out something, you'll right out of the gate on this. You'll notice that there's in this limbic system, there's no particular region, there's no anatomical area of the brain that is going to be called the limbic structure, but rather it's a system. It's the only portion of the brain that's referred to as a system because what it involves is a collection of various structures, nuclei, or regions of the brain that interact to relate to these emotions. And so, hopefully, this is intriguing, perhaps somewhat vague, but that's the point of the video. And so when someone speaks aloud about the limbic system, it sort of sounds as I was saying before, like a single structure, but that's simply not the case. It's really a collection of structures that work together collaboratively. And basically, it's located on sort of both sides of the thalamus. And again, there's more images that are going to be coming on this, and it's below the cerebrum. And but the truth be told, part of the cerebral cortex is part of this as well. It's and you know I should point out that it's not well understood. And when I say it's not well understood, it's not just me. It's a lot of neuroscientists have been learning and have been experimenting and doing all kinds of research in this area for many decades. And I find it almost more interesting when less is known. It kind of stimulates more curiosity, if you will. So I hope it does for you as well. Again, that's the point of the video, is to not to explain everything, but rather to incite more questions about the topic. And so in those early days of brain science, it was thought that these structures were really, really related to smell. And I will say that a lot of that came from research done working with rats. Now, if you were to take a look at a rat brain, the olfactory area, in other words, the smell, is huge in the brain of a rat because it gets a lot of sensory input from smell, and therefore its emotions are linked to that. And so we thought that that this was, the origin, the rhinencephalon, a rat brain, was a really important part of the lymphatic system. But as it turns out, the lymphatic system is more about depending on the organism. Like we rely a little bit on smell, olfactory, but we have vision, and other organisms rely on hearing. And so all of that sensory input comes in, and then we deal with it emotionally. In other words, if we hear something, or we hear bird songs and we're stimulated to want to respond to them, or we hear something scary, and so, or we see something, and so there's a lot of really cool comparative anatomy having to do with behavior in terms of evolutionary significance of the system that we're talking about, the limbic system. And so there's debate about the number of structures that are involved, and there's one could argue, if you really know what you're talking about, that many, if not all, structures of the brain are part of this emotional response and limbic system. But I'm just going to break it down because there's unanimous agreement that there's three most important structures. Although, of course, if you know me, I'm going to bring up a couple more. But it's the amygdala, which are two little tiny structures that reminded early anatomists of the structure of an almond, and that's where it gets its name. The hippocampus, which is a really cool structure, and Cingulate Gyrus. And so that particular area is actually literally part of the cerebellum. And so more to come about these structures. And so functionally, just to give you a flyover understanding of, what is the limbic system doing, it's basically having everything to do with emotional states. It establishes these emotional states that we have. In other words, fear or anger or happiness, these kinds of things. And obviously that this is it links to conscious functions of the cerebral cortex. In other words, decision making about that. And so when we face a particular emotion, we need to decide what we want to do with it. And then there's autonomic kind of responses as well. And so this limbic system, when it takes in emotion and fear, like for example, if it hears something scary, then that might trigger a response in hormones, and that will link with an endocrine response. And ultimately, it will involve perhaps movement, and that'll involve sending nerve impulses down the brainstem, motor neurons, and affect an action. And so it's really cross communication. Communication is the theme here, that the limbic system is sort of this emotional hub of all different kinds of structures, but it's all about communicating and getting things done. And then if that wasn't enough, it facilitates the limbic system storage of memory. In other words, where new memories are formed. And that's important too, because if you think about it evolutionarily speaking, learning is an important part of survival, and especially things that cause emotional distress. In other words, it behooves us to remember things that put ourselves in fatal danger. And so memory has got to be part of this process of emotion. And so there's going to be areas, as I alluded to before with this Cingulate Gyrus, there's particular lobes of the cerebral hemisphere that are particularly important in this. The hippocampus, and again, there's a para meaning to the side, hippocampal gyrus, that's important as well. So these are part of the cerebral hemisphere. I just wanted to point that out. So just to back it off just for a second, a gyrus, if you're unfamiliar with that, is this convolution or fold that we have in the brain. And those folds, when you think of the classic picture of the brain, all of those folds help to increase the surface area. And that, of course, or maybe not of course, but that increases the number of neurons that can be present in that area. And gray matter, when we talk about gray matter, what we're talking about is clusters of nuclei or soma, if you will, of the neuron itself. And those tend to be gray in coloration as opposed to white matter, which is more of the cords or axons that are coming out of it. And so there's many gyra that interact in the limbic system in the brain as a whole. Just want to point that out. So these two structures are really cool. They sort of arc around like this. They're highlighted in blue. Cingulate gyrus right in here. And so what are those up to? So again, this is a superficial coverage of what these structures are doing. But if you've ever been so excited that your arms are flailing in the air, and you're so angry that you're clenching your fists and clenching them, this portion of the brain is responsible for this. So it plays. Let me go back to that. It plays a role in expressing emotion through gesture. Okay, and so this is complicated, though. I just wanted to point out that in terms of this, the cerebral cortex on the very top, right in here, there's a separation here which is known as the central gyrus, and anything to the front of this, and this is in the back, this is the front of the brain, so this is anterior. So at the very posterior part of the frontal lobe is this motor cortex, which is responsible for decision making, for motion, and then at the very anterior part of the parietal lobe is this somatosensory area. And so this is where we perceive and decide on skeletal motion. This is where we sense or perceive sensory information. And so this is also, there's connections here as well. And so this is responsible for, in terms of the motor area and sensory area are part of recognizing what part of the brain is being stimulated, and decisions need to be made accordingly. And so this is related to uh, receiving emotional input. Okay, and so below the thalamus, okay, one might be able to have thought about that. Hypo meaning below something. So below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus, small, it's about the size of a kidney bean, but powerful. It is involved in this because when there's a situation where the body's in danger, for example, uh, though the hypothalamus works autotomically in the autonomic nervous system, it's able to produce hormones that cause pituitary gland to secrete hormones that will cause other organs in the body to secrete. For example, if there's a stressful situation, the hypothalamus might get the pituitary gland to start releasing hormones that will stimulate the production of adrenaline or the production of cortisol. So, cortisol releasing hormone, for example, does that because then it causes the pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropin hormone. In other words, causing the adrenal gland to produce cortisol, which is then going to increase energy production. And so this is famously known as fight or flight. Likewise, in terms of controlling autonomically, in other words, not consciously, sort of a suppressive kind of situation. In other words, a calming. It's either rest and digest. So it's able to inhibit and incite endocrine glands, which then produce hormones which cause response to emotion. So that's part of it too. So this hippocampus, as you can see here highlighted in blue, is involved in memory processing. And as I alluded to this before, I find this to be particularly interesting because, again, emotion, whether it be seeing something or remembering something having that caused an emotional response, is useful. And so it makes logical sense that the hippocampus, this region right here, and there's two of them, are involved in memory is very logical. And so the word hippocampus, just for a moment, is kind of an interesting thing. If you look up at Greek mythology, you'll find that hippocamp, which hippo kind of from Greek meaning horse, but also part of it being like the tail end, sort of like a centaur a little bit, or a chimera, like a combination of a hybrid organism, is part of an eel or a fish, a horse and a fish. But actually, it reminded early anatomists of the fact that it looked a little bit like a seahorse. Maybe, perhaps, but it's found in the medial temporal lobe, and it consists mostly of gray matter, the hippocampus, which means that there's a lot of nuclei in this area. And again, the fact that it's a bulge, just to point this out, the fact that it's identifiable like this is suggestive of the fact that there's a lot of soma in this particular area, and that's why it makes this cluster like this. And it's the memory forming center. And so it helps, a little bit more detail in this, it helps to convert your short-term memory into long-term memory. All right, that's interesting too. So, and then I was saying before that memories are related to emotions as well. And so people that have damage to the hippocampus have trouble forming new memories. I find that to be pretty interesting. Okay, so in other words, a negative, we're able to determine what the hippocampus does when it's not functioning properly. But yet, the things that they experience then just simply fade away. But what's interesting about this is that their long-term memory is still intact, which is suggestive that long-term memory is not where it's not stored in the hippocampus. And so this area right in here, as you can see here, I know that it's difficult to see. Again, it's one thing in a picture like this to put blue arrows here, and you're like, look at this. It's the Dentate Gyrus, which is thought to contribute to the formation of new memories. It's this sort of area uh, within the hippocampus in particular that is where new memories are formed. But it'd be another thing to be able to identify it in an actual brain. It's pretty difficult. And so memories, as I was saying before, are not stored in the hippocampus, but rather cognitive and sensory experiences are organized and unified in terms of long-term memory, and that is throughout the cerebral cortex. And so when you experience something like touching something very hot for the very first time, you know, like okay, you know, you'll remember that, right? The hippocampus learns from the sensory input that's not that's not good to be touching fire. So and then it plays the memory back repeatedly if that were to occur again, or it sort of like conditions it a little bit into the cerebral cortex. So therefore, long-term memory is established. Uh, this concept is called memory consolidation. And so, boy, if this is not understating this, I mean, this is how learning is taking place. And so, this video isn't about that, but I hope you're appreciating the magnitude of what we're kicking around right here in terms of how the hippocampus will pick up short-term experiences, sensory and otherwise, and then consolidate them into long-term memory for future. So it's kind of cool in terms of how the body uses its brain in order to respond in the future. And so learning can be thought of as a behavioral modification to previous experience. Okay, so think of the hippocampus's way of teaching the cerebral cortex. Okay, that's kind of a funny way to think of it, but memory consolidation continues in the form of long-term memory, and again, which is held in a variety of areas. And this video isn't about that, but different memories are housed in different locations within the cerebral cortex. That's pretty interesting there. And so more about the various components or structures within the limbic system. The fornix is a particular tract of white matter that connects the hippocampus, shown here, with the hypothalamus. And the fornix, the term itself is kind of an interesting term. Each of these are related to either Greek or Latin, but I find this to be somewhat interesting. So if you don't mind, it's a little sidebar on this. The fornix, it comes from, like, when you think of back in the Roman gladiator times, and some of those events had prostitution and prostitutes hanging out around the Colosseum. And so when people said that they were going to go to the arches of the Colosseum, the fornix, it was kind of associated with the fact that might mean that they were going to go pick up a prostitute, and so fornicate comes from this idea of fornix. And that to be kind of interesting. And so right at the very tip of the hippocampus, you get these two almond-like structures called the amygdala, and this is known as the aggression center. And again, that's simplification. Hopefully, this is intriguing enough to stimulate further understanding. But this is your aggression center in the brain, the amygdala. But the truth is that it acts as an interface between the limbic system and the cerebrum. In other words, various sensory systems need to be called into play here. And so this whole idea of the emotional response of the limbic system being separate from a sort of rational, thought-provoking decision making isn't really true. There's lots of connection and communication that goes from decision making and aggression, whether or not to act or to not act accordingly. And so, just to sort of bring this up, how do we know these things and stuff? So, in other words, when the amygdala is stimulated, and I won't go into necessarily how that occurs, but I'll just put a plus here saying that the neurons can be stimulated, in other words, caused to be fired in the brain. And what we see in not only in animal models but also in humans. We see an increased anger, violence, fear, and anxiety. So this anxiety is stimulated by the amygdala. And again, this isn't necessarily, don't think of it as being such a bad thing. But anxiety and fear is useful information in terms of getting us out of harm's way. I mean, one could say that those members of the population that didn't have a lot of anxiety and fear uh, didn't survive. Okay, so you be blunt about that. So anxiety disorders, however, are curious when we study things that aren't going well. So anxiety disorders or experiencing an anxiety attack is overboard. So having too much is bad. And so sometimes these patients are prescribed medication. And again, I'm not a physician, but one of the more common pharmacological medicines that are given are these sort of benzoid, I'm sorry, benzoid di, diazepam, or just benzoids, if you, difficult pronouncing that. So they act basically to inhibit the amygdala. And so what is happening here is that it's sort of a mellowing effect. These benzoids provide sort of a calm if you're experiencing anxiety to a hyper state. And so what that does is, interestingly, these medications cause hyper-orality, meaning that the individual has maybe increased desire to putting things in their mouth, increased hunger, or hypersexuality, increased desire for sexual activity. And this is curious, less inhibited behavior, so more reckless under the influence of benzoids, which is kind of curious. All of these sort of, if I could make this simplified, are a little bit related to benzoids. Act a little bit like what alcohol might be doing to a person. In other words, increasing sexual activity, hunger, and also inhibiting behavior a little bit, like sort of running around with the lampshade. So inhibited, like your social controls are not fully functional. And so, again, superficial understanding of that. And so what's happening here is that the outputs from the amygdala goes either to the hypothalamus, and if that's the case, the hypothalamus is going to act on a sort of autonomic basis. It's going to, as I mentioned before, it's going to produce these hormones, and it's going to cause perhaps increased heart rate, or it's going to produce indirectly influence the production of cortisol and adrenaline, for example. Or it could go to the prefrontal part of the cortex as well. And so that helps to think about what is happening. And so as I was saying, the hypothalamus influences visceral and somatic motor systems, ultimately heart rate, that sort of thing, breathing rate, respiration, hormones, like your heart racing. Whereas the prefrontal influence is conscious response. In other words, like as a result of this emotion, you might act on it. In other words, I'm going to do this act of violence, or I'm going to tell someone, keep it positive, tell someone that I love them. Or it could be, though I'm feeling this, I'm going to actually consciously control this anger and not act on it. Okay, and so just to wrap this up, again, these two little, small but powerful little almond structures right here, amygdala, are all controlling that area. Now, the thalamus is, I mentioned a little bit hypothalamus. The thalamus is superior to the hypothalamus, and there's two lobes to it. And basically, it's a relay system where all kinds of nerve impulses are coming into the thalamus, and that's sending and routing all of that information to all the different parts of the brain. So clearly, if you're following this, the thalamus has to be part of this limbic system. It has to be, because these emotions are related to and contingent on things that we're seeing. So sensory information is that comes into this thalamus, and then that gets shot out to different areas in the cerebral cortex. Things that you touch and hear, we're going to have a response to. And so, in particular, just to point this out, it's in this interior part or sub-region right in here. And again, if you're a neuroscientist, you get into all these little substructures within parts of the brain, and that is part of this interior nuclei are part of the limbic system because it's affecting related to emotion. Okay, and so as I was saying, this interior nuclei, and again, interior nuclei, don't get overwhelmed. It's just the soma involved in the neurons, and that relays information from, for example, the mammillary bodies to the cingulate gyrus. The mammillary bodies are also involved in memory, right in here, and reticular formation. If you're familiar with that, these are tracts of neurons that either stimulate or inhibit emotion, and these are found within the thalamus, and the range of emotion. So rage and fear, pain, sexual arousal, pleasure, these kinds of things are being routed and being sent to different parts of the cortex, the cerebral cortex, and that's happening in the thalamus, which is right in this location right there. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that presentation on the lymphatic system, and hopefully it stirred your curiosity. And thanks for watching.